When the Empire first considered humanity for diplomatic service, it seemed like a natural fit. After all, humans had a reputation for adaptability. They learned languages quickly, they integrated into foreign environments with ease, and they were unusually skilled at reading emotions across cultural lines. To alien strategists, this looked like the perfect recipe for diplomacy. What they wanted were professional negotiators who could walk into a hostile council chamber and return with signatures instead of scars. Diplomacy, as the galaxy understood it, was an art of restraint. Most species prized formality above all else. Words were carefully measured, gestures rehearsed, and even the smallest rituals carried enormous significance. To make peace was to show patience. To reach compromise was to avoid offense. A good diplomat, in alien eyes, was invisible, someone who moved discussions along without ever drawing attention to themselves. And so, when the request for human diplomats went out, the assumption was simple: humanity would learn the rules, follow the protocols, and behave just as quietly as everyone else. They would bow when bowing was expected, use the proper honorifics, and wrap every disagreement in layers of politeness. Their role was never to dominate or to challenge, but simply to smooth out tensions and deliver agreements already shaped by higher powers. The Empire even imagined that humans might be better at this than most species. On their homeworld, after all, they had developed thousands of cultures and hundreds of languages. They had centuries of experience balancing rival groups and negotiating fragile truces. If any species understood the importance of peace, it had to be them. Surely, the logic went, they would carry those lessons into the stars. But what the Empire failed to consider was the why behind human diplomacy. On Earth, compromise was rarely about politeness for its own sake. It was about survival. Peace treaties were signed because wars had dragged on too long and resources had run thin. Alliances were forged because facing the enemy alone meant certain defeat. Even human traditions of courtesy, handshakes, toasts, formal greetings were rooted in suspicion. The handshake, for example, began as proof that one wasn't carrying a weapon. Hospitality rituals existed to turn strangers into allies before they could become threats. Aliens didn't know this history, they only saw the surface, the smiles, the speeches, the ceremonies. They thought humans would slip into their councils, like oil on water, smoothing away friction with soft words. What they didn't realize was that human diplomacy carried an entirely different flavor, one shaped by the constant pressure of a dangerous world. This misunderstanding was more than just cultural, it was structural. To most alien powers, diplomacy was a shield against war. To humans, diplomacy was a weapon as sharp as any blade. Where others saw it as the avoidance of conflict, humans saw it as another battlefield, one where the stakes were no less real, and where victory required just as much cunning as any fight. So, when the first human diplomats arrived, they carried expectations on their shoulders. They were supposed to be calm, deferential, and endlessly polite. They were supposed to represent peace in its gentlest form. That was what the Empire had asked for, professionals who would soothe tempers, not inflame them. Instead, what they got was something no one had predicted, because while humans could certainly play the role of polite negotiator, beneath that civility was the mind of a Deathworlder, always watching, always calculating, always ready to push back if survival required it. The galaxy had asked for diplomats. What they had unknowingly invited into their councils were predators who treated every negotiation not as ceremony, but as survival. The first time humans were sent as official diplomats, the Empire expected little more than a formality. A border dispute between two minor client species had dragged on for years, fueled by pride and ritualized grudges. Alien mediators had tried again and again, but every meeting dissolved into ceremony, posturing, and carefully worded insults. The hope was that humans, with their adaptability and quick wit, might break the stalemate. At worst, they would fail as everyone else had failed. The two delegations gathered in a grand council chamber, each side draped in traditional colors, surrounded by advisors who had memorized centuries of etiquette. The human envoy entered with a respectful nod but wasted no time on the long recitations expected of a diplomat. Instead, he introduced himself plainly, sat down, and asked both parties to explain what they actually wanted. The room froze. According to protocol, the opening alone should have taken hours. Yet here was a human cutting directly to the heart of the matter within minutes. At first, the aliens thought this must be a mistake. Surely the envoy hadn't studied their customs properly, but, as the meeting went on, it became clear this wasn't ignorance, it was intent. The human listened closely, interrupted when answers grew evasive, and asked questions no one had dared to raise. He pointed out contradictions. He laughed at empty threats. When one side tried to storm out, the human calmly reminded them that walking away would mean losing any chance at trade routes they desperately needed. It was not aggression, but neither was it submission. It was survival logic laid bare. To the aliens present, this was shocking. Diplomacy was supposed to be a dance, a ritualized exchange of words that avoided direct confrontation. Humans, it turned out, didn't dance. They sparred. Every phrase was measured, every counterpoint delivered with precision. Yet, to the surprise of everyone, progress was made. After hours of this blunt, relentless questioning, both sides grudgingly admitted that their real issue wasn't honor or tradition, it was water rights. A deal was signed that very night. News of this spread quickly. Reports described the human diplomat as disrespectful, unrefined, even dangerous, but they also admitted something no other and had accomplished in decades. The humans got results. The treaty held, and trade resumed. For the Empire, this was both thrilling and unsettling. The second encounter was even more telling. In a dispute involving a militaristic species known for intimidation tactics, the human envoy refused to be cowed. Where alien diplomats would have responded with carefully worded deference, the human leaned forward, locked eyes, and said, "If you keep threatening people at the table, you won't have anyone left to trade with." The silence that followed was heavy, but the threat worked not because it was backed by military power, but because it was delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had stared down danger before. Aliens began to realize that humans brought more than words into the chamber. They brought presence. Body language, tone, even silence became tools in their hands. To species who prized ritual, this felt reckless, even frightening. To humans, it was second nature. On a death world, communication had always carried weight. Tone and posture could mean the difference between calming a tense situation and triggering violence. They carried those instincts with them, and in negotiations, those instincts proved powerful. Not every encounter ended smoothly. Some alien leaders walked away offended, vowing never to deal with humans again. Yet, even in those cases, the damage rarely lasted. The same bluntness that upset them also made humans hard to ignore. They spoke plainly. They meant what they said. And in a galaxy where diplomacy often dissolved into endless ceremony, that kind of honesty had its own strange appeal. Over time, it became clear that humans were not diplomats in the galactic sense. They were negotiators, dealmakers, survivors. They didn't try to avoid conflict at the table. They confronted it head-on, peeled back the layers of pretense, and forced everyone to face the truth of their situation. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't polite, but more often than not, it worked. For the Empire, this created a dilemma. On one hand, they had asked for diplomats, and what they got instead unsettled them. On the other hand, treaties were being signed, disputes were being resolved, and wars were being prevented. The results spoke for themselves, and so, despite their unease, they kept sending humans into the chambers of power. Because even if the galaxy didn't understand their methods, one fact became harder and harder to deny: Deathworlders could negotiate with the same ferocity they brought to survival. To understand why humans negotiated the way they did, you had to look at where they came from. Earth wasn't a gentle world. It was a place that forced its species to adapt, to fight for resources, and to form alliances just to survive. In that environment, diplomacy wasn't born out of politeness, it was born out of necessity. For humans, negotiation was never about empty ceremony, it was about getting something concrete done. On Earth, tribes forged alliances because enemies were stronger together than apart. Kingdoms signed treaties because war had drained their treasuries. Nations built coalitions because survival required cooperation. Every handshake, every promise, every pact carried with it the weight of survival. The rituals and courtesies that developed around diplomacy were practical tools, not sacred traditions. This mindset carried into the stars. When humans sat down at a negotiation table, they weren't thinking about avoiding offense at all costs. They were thinking, what do these people want? What do they fear? What do we need to walk away with? It wasn't hostility, it was clarity. A negotiation, to them, was a battlefield where words were the weapons, and victory was measured in outcomes, not appearances. Part of what unsettled aliens was the human willingness to confront problems directly. Most species had developed diplomatic traditions that prioritized harmony over honesty. Offense was to be avoided, even if it meant pretending problems didn't exist. Humans found this baffling. To them, ignoring a problem only gave it room to grow. On Earth, unresolved disputes turned into wars, feuds, or betrayals. Better to bring tension into the open and resolve it than let it fester. That approach made humans appear blunt, sometimes even rude, but underneath it carried a kind of respect. By speaking plainly, they treated their counterparts as equals, partners capable of hearing the truth and responding to it. In many cases, alien negotiators realized that while human words could sting, they were rarely deceptive. You didn't have to wonder what a human really meant. You just had to be ready for their honesty. But another key trait was persistence. Humans didn't give up when talks grew difficult. They stayed late into the night. They revisited points from new angles, and they searched relentlessly for common ground. Two species used a rigid ceremony. This endurance was unnerving. Negotiations were supposed to end after a set number of hours, even if nothing was resolved. Humans refused that limit. To them, walking away without progress felt like failure. If survival was at stake, you stayed until a solution was found. Their history also gave them unusual tools. Centuries of colonization, rebellion, and international politics had taught them how to bargain from a position of weakness as well as strength. They knew how to appeal to pride, how to offer concessions without losing face, how to turn an insult into an opportunity. Many alien species had never needed these skills. They lived in stable environments with fewer rivals. Humans, by contrast, had been forced to practice them for millennia. Even their emotional range became part of their strategy. Aliens often mistook human humor as inappropriate, yet it broke tension in ways ceremony never could. Their flashes of anger, while startling, showed sincerity rather than manipulation. Their empathy, too, was powerful. Humans had an instinct for reading others, for noticing the small shifts in tone or expression that revealed deeper truths. On Earth, that skill had been vital for survival. In diplomacy, it let them cut through masks that other species never even realized they wore. What the galaxy saw as Deathworld diplomacy wasn't aggression for its own sake. It was survival turned into an art. Humans brought to the table the same instincts that had carried them through storms, famines, and wars. The ability to endure, to adapt, and to find solutions under pressure. They didn't view negotiation as something delicate and fragile. To them, it was as natural as breathing, as necessary as food and water. In the end, the human way of diplomacy could be summed up in a single truth. Survival required honesty, courage, and persistence. Where others saw diplomacy as theater, humans saw it as life and death. And once the galaxy understood this, it became clear why humans could never be the kind of diplomats the Empire had expected. The first reports about human diplomats caused a stir across the Empire. Every major power studied them closely, trying to decide whether these newcomers were a gift or a threat. The reactions varied wildly, shaped as much by cultural expectations as by the encounters themselves. For some species, humans were simply terrifying. Civilizations that prized ritual and subtlety couldn't comprehend how blunt words could possibly lead to peace. To them, the human habit of cutting straight to the point looked like aggression. A question that seemed perfectly reasonable to a human, "What do you actually want from this treaty?" struck them as invasive, even insulting. For these cultures, human negotiators were like wild animals in the council chamber, unpredictable, dangerous, and difficult to control. Others reacted with frustration. Accustomed to endless ceremony, they found human persistence exhausting. Negotiations that should have ended in dignified silence stretched on into the night, driven by a human unwillingness to leave without progress. To some species, this looked like stubbornness bordering on madness, and yet, even as they complained, they couldn't deny the results. Agreements that had seemed impossible were suddenly being signed, not because humans respected tradition, but because they ignored it. Then, there were those who found something refreshing in the human approach. A few species recognized in humans a kind of kinship. They, too, had histories of hardship, of survival through struggle. To them, the human style of diplomacy, direct, pragmatic, and unafraid of conflict, felt familiar. These species often became humanity's earliest allies. They appreciated that humans didn't waste time on meaningless gestures. When humans promised something, it was usually meant. When they issued a warning, it wasn't idle posturing. Trust built quickly in those circles, even if the process looked chaotic to outsiders. One particularly notable reaction came from a species known for dominance games. Their entire diplomatic tradition revolved around intimidation. Meetings were contests of posture, silence, and veiled threats. At first, they assumed humans would fold under pressure. Instead, they discovered that humans met intimidation with calm defiance, a long stare, a steady voice, a refusal to flinch. In one famous account, a human envoy actually laughed during a rival's carefully rehearsed display of dominance. The alien delegation left unsettled, unsure whether the human had failed to recognize the threat or had recognized it and simply didn't care. Either way, the effect was the same. Their bluff had been called. Some of the most surprising responses came from species that valued honesty above all else. To them, human bluntness wasn't a weakness but a virtue. In a galaxy where deception and ritual often clouded meaning, humans cut through the fog. They might be rough around the edges, but their words carried a clarity that was rare. These cultures began requesting human envoys specifically, preferring their plain speech to the endless politeness of traditional diplomats. Of course, admiration was never universal. In many cases, human diplomats left chambers with both new allies and new enemies. Some alien leaders simply couldn't tolerate the disruption of their traditions. To them, humans were dangerous outsiders, destabilizing the fragile balance of galactic politics. Rumors spread that humans used psychological warfare in negotiations, that their smiles hid veiled threats, that their empathy was just another tool of manipulation. Whether these claims were true or not mattered less than the fear they inspired. But perhaps the most interesting reaction wasn't fear or admiration, it was adaptation. Slowly, some alien species began copying human methods. They shortened their rituals. They allowed more direct questioning. A few even attempted humor in council chambers, though with mixed results. The presence of humans didn't just change outcomes, it started changing the very style of galactic diplomacy. In time, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whether aliens liked them or not, human diplomats could not be dismissed. They upset expectations, yes, but they also solved problems others had abandoned as hopeless. Where other envoys sought harmony, humans sought resolution. Where others preserved appearances, humans demanded results. The galaxy had asked for diplomats, expecting polite intermediaries who would preserve the old order. Instead, they had invited in Deathworlders who redefined what diplomacy meant. The reactions, fear, frustration, respect, were as varied as the species themselves, but one by one, they all learned the same lesson. When humans sat at the table, the conversation would not end the way anyone expected. At first, human diplomats were seen as a curiosity, unorthodox, unpredictable, but useful in the right situations. Yet as more cases piled up, it became clear that they weren't just solving disputes. They were shifting the very foundations of how diplomacy was practiced across the galaxy. The change began small. Alien councils noticed that negotiations involving humans tended to move faster. Centuries-old disputes that had languished under endless layers of ritual were suddenly resolved in weeks. Trade agreements expanded, borders stabilized, and cooperation increased in regions where stalemates had once been the norm. While some leaders grumbled about the humans' lack of refinement, others couldn't ignore the practical benefits. But the real transformation came when humans began to influence strategy. Unlike traditional diplomats, who thought in terms of preserving order and ritual, humans approached negotiations as contests of survival and advantage. They didn't just accept the terms laid before them, they looked for leverage. They spotted hidden weaknesses in positions, exposed contradictions, and reframed arguments in ways that left their counterparts off balance. This style rippled outward. Other species, even those who disliked humans, had to adjust their own strategies just to keep up. Some began adopting human bluntness in small doses, stripping away layers of unnecessary formality. Others tried to counter human persistence by developing endurance of their own, staying longer at the table, pushing harder than before. What had once been a stagnant process was now alive with energy and tension. The empire itself was forced to adapt. Its diplomats had been trained in centuries-old traditions of formality and patience. Suddenly, they found themselves outmaneuvered, not just by humans, but by other species learning from them. Manuals were rewritten, training programs updated. Councils that had once frowned upon human methods began quietly instructing their own negotiators to study them. The shift was gradual but undeniable. Galactic diplomacy was no longer what it had been. The greatest shock came when humans began brokering not just peace between rivals, but alliances that had previously seemed impossible. Species with histories of bloodshed, who had sworn never to sit at the same table, found themselves persuaded into cooperation. Humans didn't achieve this by ignoring the past or smoothing it over with polite words. Instead, They confronted it directly. They acknowledged grievances, admitted harsh truths, and then asked the simplest question of all: what happens if you don't work together? This question, rooted in survival logic, had a power few could resist, because, on Earth, survival had always depended on unlikely partnerships. Enemies became allies when greater threats loomed. Rivals learned to share resources when famine struck. That instinct, carried into the stars, allowed humans to see opportunities where others saw only dead ends. Not everyone welcomed the change. Some powers accused humans of destabilizing the old order. They argued that by ignoring tradition, humans were eroding the very foundations of diplomacy. In a sense, they were right. The carefully maintained balance of power, held in place by ritual and ceremony, was shifting under human influence. But for many, that was precisely the point. Tradition had preserved stalemates for centuries. Humans were offering movement even if it came with risk. Over time, patterns emerged. When conflicts grew especially bitter, when negotiations seemed hopeless, more and more often, the call went out for human envoys. They became the Empire's problem solvers of last resort, the ones who could cut through the noise and force progress. What began as an experiment turned into a necessity. Councils that had once resisted their presence now relied on them. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The galaxy had asked for diplomats to maintain the status quo. Instead, they got Death, who reshaped it entirely. The game had changed, and there was no going back. Even those who hated the human approach were forced to admit the truth. Once humans entered the chamber, the rules of diplomacy would never be the same again. When the Empire first called for diplomats, it imagined calm voices, polished manners, and endless patience. What it received instead were humans survivors from a Deathworld, who treated negotiation less like a ceremony and more like a battlefield. At first, this mismatch was jarring. Alien observers whispered that humans were crude, impatient, even dangerous. But, over time, a clearer picture emerged. The truth was that humans had always been diplomats, just not in the way the galaxy expected. Their history on Earth had been a constant series of negotiations, alliances, betrayals, and reconciliations. They had learned to make peace with neighbors they couldn't overpower, to trade with rivals they couldn't destroy, and to unite with enemies when survival demanded it. For them, diplomacy wasn't about ceremony, it was about finding a path forward, no matter how ugly the process might be, and that was what made them different. Where other species hesitated to speak uncomfortable truths, humans laid them bare. Where others feared offense, humans risked it. Where others ended talks at the first sign of failure, humans pushed on, driven by the stubborn belief that there had to be a way through. Their style was messy, unpredictable, and often unsettling, yet time and again, it produced results. The galaxy learned that human diplomacy was not about avoiding conflict, it was about navigating it. It was about turning disagreement into dialogue, hostility into grudging cooperation, and stalemates into solutions. Their words carried the weight of a species that had learned the hard way what happens when negotiations fail: war, famine, collapse. They had seen those outcomes too many times on their homeworld to ever treat diplomacy as a game. Some alien leaders came to admire this honesty, others feared it, but none could ignore it. Humans had become something new in the halls of power, not just envoys but catalysts. They forced clarity where there had been obfuscation, they forced choices where there had been delay, they forced progress, even when it hurt. And in doing so, they revealed a hard truth the galaxy hadn't wanted to face. Diplomacy without risk was no diplomacy at all. Over time, even the skeptics began to see the value. Wars were averted, resources were shared, old grudges eased, not because humans brought charm or elegance, but because they brought persistence, courage, and a refusal to accept failure as an option. They were not the diplomats the galaxy had asked for, but they were the ones it needed. Looking back, historians would call this period the beginning of the Deathworld era of diplomacy, an era when negotiations ceased to be a ritual and became a tool of survival and change, an era when the old rules no longer held. Because one species had shown the galaxy that rules were only useful if they worked. And perhaps that was the greatest irony of all. By breaking tradition, humans ended up creating something stronger. They didn't destroy diplomacy, they remade it. They reminded the galaxy that at its heart, diplomacy wasn't about appearances or ceremony, it was about people finding a way to live together in spite of everything pulling them apart. So when the Empire asked for diplomats, it expected polite voices to maintain the status quo. What it got were Deathworlders who carried the scars of their own brutal history and turned them into tools for peace. Not peace born of avoidance, but peace earned through struggle, honesty, and resilience. And in the end, that was the lesson every species came to learn. If you invite humans to the table, be prepared for more than diplomacy. Be prepared for survival itself, distilled into words.